The Bordeaux hit my face like a slap from hell itself. Red wine dripped from my chin onto my white dress shirt as the entire Torrin family table went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then Calla Torrin started laughing, that high-pitched cackle she'd perfected since childhood. "Thanks, Dad. Maybe that'll teach him some respect, filthy pig." Drake Torrin sat back in his mahogany dining chair, satisfied as a king who'd just executed a peasant. His weathered construction worker hands still gripped the crystal wine glass, empty now except for the dregs that clung to the sides like accusations. My wife Ember said nothing. She studied her manicured nails as if they held the secrets of the universe, her silence more damning than any words could have been. Around the table, the rest of the New Year's dinner party pretended to look elsewhere, at their plates, at the chandelier, at anything except the man dripping with their patriarch's vintage contempt. I felt my hands grip the arms of my chair. The antique wood creaked under the pressure, and for a moment I wondered if it might snap. Instead, I stood up slowly, deliberately, like a man who'd just made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 2 years. "Colonel," I said when he picked up on the second ring, "it's time." The table stared at me like I'd just announced my intention to run for president. Drake's bushy eyebrows drew together in confusion. Calla's laughter died in her throat. Even Ember looked up from her nails. "Time for what?" Drake demanded, his voice carrying that Texas drawl that had intimidated contractors and city councilmen for 40 years. I wiped wine from my face with the linen napkin, set it carefully beside my untouched prime rib, and smiled. Not the fake smile I'd worn to family dinners for 8 years of marriage, but something else entirely. Something that made Calla shift uncomfortably in her chair. "You'll see," I said. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you time to plan. For 8 years, I'd been Holden Ravel, the quiet cybersecurity consultant who married above his station. The man who nodded politely when Drake questioned my income, my background, my worthiness to carry the Torrin name through marriage. The man who endured Calla's barbed comments about my humble origins and Ember's increasingly cold shoulder. What they didn't know was that before I became a cybersecurity consultant, I spent 12 years in defense intelligence. Specifically, I specialized in weapons procurement fraud, tracking down contractors who billed the Pentagon for equipment they never delivered, armor plating they never installed, safety systems that existed only on paper. I was very good at my job. Good enough that when I left the service, I took with me a particular set of skills and a very specific understanding of how government contracts worked. Good enough that I'd spent the last 3 years quietly documenting every suspicious transaction that flowed through Drake Torrin Construction. $47 million in false invoices over 6 years. Armor plating for military vehicles that was never installed. Safety equipment that existed only in Drake's creative accounting. The Pentagon had been paying premium prices for substandard work, and Drake had been pocketing the difference. I had documentation. I had photographs. I had shipping manifests and material receipts that told a story of systematic fraud on a scale that would make federal prosecutors salivate. But that was just the beginning. As I drove home through the January night, my shirt still stained with Drake's wine, I thought about the house I was returning to. The house Ember and I had bought 8 years ago, in the early days of our marriage, when she still pretended to love me. What Ember didn't know was that I'd recently discovered something interesting about our property deed. The house was titled in Drake's LLC. Ember had signed transfer documents temporarily for tax purposes 3 years ago, she'd told me. Just a formality to help with Drake's business structure. The transfer was never reversed. Legally, I'd been living in Drake Torrin's house for 3 years, paying a mortgage on property I didn't own. If Ember decided to leave me, which her recent behavior suggested she was considering, I'd have no claim to the home I'd been paying for. Clever. Except that Drake had made one crucial mistake. When you transfer property for fraudulent purposes, especially property purchased with funds from federal contracts, that property becomes subject to asset forfeiture. Every payment I'd made on the mortgage, every improvement I'd funded, had been subsidized by Drake's Pentagon fraud. The federal government takes a dim view of such arrangements. I pulled into my driveway, Drake's driveway, and sat in the darkness for a moment. Through the living room window, I could see Ember's silhouette. She was on the phone, probably calling Calla to rehash the evening's entertainment, probably laughing about the look on my face when the wine hit. My phone buzzed with a text from Colonel. Received. When do we move? I typed back, soon, very soon. The Colonel was retired Army intelligence, now working as a private investigator in Houston. We'd served together in Afghanistan, tracking supply chain fraud that was getting soldiers injured with defective equipment. He understood the stakes when contractors cut corners for profit. He also understood the satisfaction of watching those contractors face justice. More importantly, he understood that sometimes justice needed a little help finding its way. I walked into my house, Drake's house, and found Ember exactly where I'd expected her. She was curled up on the leather sofa, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in the low, conspiratorial tone she used when discussing family business. He just stood there, she was saying, like he was planning something. It was actually a little creepy. She looked up when I entered, her expression shifting from gossipy amusement to wary calculation. After 8 years of marriage, she'd developed a finely tuned sense of my moods. Tonight, she was sensing something new. I have to go, she said into the phone. Holden's home. She hung up and watched me with the careful attention of a woman who'd just realized she might have miscalculated something important. Rough evening, I said, loosening my wine-stained tie. Daddy didn't mean anything by it, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You know how he gets when he's been drinking. Do I? Holden, don't make this into something bigger than it is. It was just what? Just your father humiliating me in front of your entire family? Just your sister calling me a pig? Just you sitting there like a statue while it happened? Ember's jaw tightened. This was familiar territory, me complaining about her family's treatment, her defending them, the argument escalating until one of us stormed out. Usually me, not tonight. I'm tired, I said. I'm going to bed. I left her sitting on the sofa, confusion flickering across her perfectly made-up face. She'd expected a fight. She'd been prepared for accusations and anger and the usual cycle of conflict and grudging reconciliation that had defined our marriage for the past 3 years. Instead, she got something that probably worried her more: my complete calm. In our bedroom, I changed out of my stained shirt and opened my laptop. 3 years of careful documentation filled encrypted folders on my hard drive, financial records, shipping manifests, photographs of construction sites where Drake's crews had installed substandard materials while billing the Pentagon for premium equipment. But the crown jewel of my collection was something else entirely: GPS data. For the past 6 months, I'd been tracking several vehicles, Ember's car, for instance, which had made 340 visits to a particular address in the upscale Riverside district. The address belonged to Asher Trevin, a defense contractor who did business with Drake's company. Asher Trevin, who was married with 2 teenage children. Asher Trevin, who'd been having an affair with my wife for the better part of a year. I'd discovered the affair 4 months ago, when Ember's business trip to Denver coincided with Asher's conference schedule. The same conference where Drake had sent her to close a deal with Trevin's company. The same trip that had lasted 5 days and produced exactly 0 documentation of any business conducted. The same trip that had happened 7 months before my son, Nate, was born. 7 months, not 9. Which meant either Nate was premature, despite his healthy birth weight of 8 pounds, 2 ounces, or Ember had been lying about more than just business trips. I closed the laptop and lay down in the darkness, listening to Ember move around downstairs. She was probably calling Calla back, or maybe texting Asher about the evening's events. It didn't matter. Tomorrow, I would start dismantling the Torrin family empire piece by piece. They wanted to treat me like a pig? Fine. But they'd forgotten something important about pigs. When cornered, they bite back, and I had very sharp teeth. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and drove to my office. Ravel Cybersecurity occupied a modest suite in a business park 20 minutes from home, nothing impressive by Torrin standards. Drake had made sure to point out repeatedly that my little company was cute compared to his construction empire. What Drake didn't know was that my little company had been hemorrhaging clients for 6 months, thanks to a systematic campaign of corporate sabotage. Contracts mysteriously canceled, security clearances questioned, clients suddenly deciding they needed more established firms for their cybersecurity needs. It had taken me 4 months to trace the sabotage back to Zane Marinor, a competitor who'd somehow gained access to my client lists, my proposal strategies, even my pricing structures, information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of my business operations, someone like my wife, who handled my administrative work and had access to all my files, someone who might share that information with her father, who might pass it along to business associates like Asher Trevin, who might find it useful to eliminate competition in the cybersecurity market. The beautiful thing about corporate espionage is that it leaves traces: digital fingerprints, email metadata, financial transactions that tell a story of coordination and conspiracy. I'd been collecting those traces for months, building a case that would not only destroy Zane Marinor's business, but implicate everyone who'd helped him, including my wife, including her father, including her lover. I was reviewing the latest evidence when Colonel called. "Talk to my contact at the FBI," he said without preamble. "Agent Tessa Hartline, Financial Crimes Division. She's very interested in your Pentagon documentation." How interested? Interested enough to fast-track a federal investigation. Interested enough to start surveillance on Drake's construction sites. Interested enough to ask if you'd be willing to testify before a grand jury. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the first real satisfaction I'd experienced in months. "What's the timeline?" "Depends on what else we can give her. Right now she's got financial fraud. If we can add weapons violations, maybe some racketeering charges, she can move faster." "Weapons violations?" "Those shipping containers you've been tracking with GPS devices. Hartline's team ran the manifests. 3 containers from Croatia declared as construction equipment. Except construction equipment doesn't usually require import licenses from the State Department." I felt my pulse quicken. "What kind of weapons?" "The kind that require federal firearms licenses to import. The kind that Drake's company definitely doesn't have licenses for. The kind that carry mandatory minimum sentences when you're caught smuggling them." This was better than I'd hoped. Financial fraud was serious, but weapon smuggling was catastrophic. The kind of charges that destroyed entire families, not just individuals. "There's something else," Colonel continued. "Hartline asked me to pass along a message. She knows about your service record. She knows about your expertise in procurement fraud. She wants to offer you a consulting contract with the FBI. "Meaning?" "Meaning you'd be working for the federal government again. Meaning you'd have resources. Meaning Drake Torrin and his family are about to discover what happens when they mess with someone who has the United States government backing him up." After I hung up with Colonel, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the conversation. The wine in my face, Calla's laughter, Ember's silence. They'd thought they were humiliating a nobody, a failed businessman married above his station, a man with no connections, no resources, no ability to fight back. They'd been wrong about everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Ember. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." I checked the GPS tracker on her car. She was at Asher Trevin's house, where she'd been spending 2 or 3 evenings a week for the past 6 months, where she'd probably continue to go until federal agents arrested her lover for weapons smuggling and conspiracy. I wondered if she'd still find him attractive in an orange jumpsuit. That evening, instead of going home to an empty house, I drove to the courthouse. Not the federal building where Drake would eventually face charges, but the county courthouse where family court convened. Where divorce proceedings and custody battles were decided by judges who were supposed to be impartial. Judges like Marlo Trasker, who'd been handling family court cases for 15 years. Who'd been Drake's roommate at Texas A&M. Who'd been receiving monthly cash payments from Drake's construction company for legal consulting that never appeared in any official records. I'd discovered the connection 6 weeks ago when I'd started researching divorce procedures. Just due diligence, I'd told myself, planning for possibilities. What I'd found was a corruption scheme that made Drake's Pentagon fraud look like petty theft. Judge Trasker had been fixing custody cases for years. Wealthy fathers who wanted to avoid child support payments. Vindictive spouses who wanted to punish their ex-partners. Anyone willing to pay Drake's consulting fees could expect favorable rulings from Judge Trasker's courtroom. The beautiful thing about judicial corruption is that it's relatively easy to prove once you know what to look for. Bank records, meeting schedules, the pattern of rulings that defied legal precedent and common sense. I had all of it, every payment, every suspicious ruling, every case where justice had been purchased instead of served. Judge Trasker was about to discover that some cases couldn't be fixed, no matter how much money changed hands. I drove home through the dark January streets, thinking about the pieces falling into place. Drake's Pentagon fraud, the weapons smuggling, the judicial corruption, Ember's affair, the corporate sabotage that had destroyed my business. Individually, each crime was serious. Together, they painted a picture of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years under the cover of legitimate business. A family that had built their wealth on fraud, corruption, and betrayal. A family that was about to lose everything. When I got home, the house was dark except for the porch light Ember had left on. I found a note on the kitchen counter. Emergency at work. Staying downtown tonight. See you tomorrow. I checked my phone. Her GPS location showed Asher's house, where her car had been parked for 3 hours. Emergency at work. Right. I poured myself a whiskey, Drake's expensive whiskey from the bottle he'd given us for Christmas, and sat in my living room, looking around at the furniture we'd bought together, the pictures we'd taken during happier times, the life we'd built on a foundation of lies. Tomorrow, I would start tearing it all down. But tonight, I allowed myself one moment of anticipation, one moment to savor what was coming. They'd wanted to break me. Instead, they'd given me every reason to break them. And unlike them, I knew how to do it properly. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Agent Tessa Hartline's office, watching her review the evidence I'd compiled. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made her dangerous to people who underestimated her, people like Drake Torrin. "This is impressive work," she said, closing the folder containing Drake's financial records. "Systematic documentation over 3 years. You've basically done our investigation for us." I had motivation. "I can see that." She leaned back in her chair. "The weapons shipment alone is enough for federal charges. Add the procurement fraud, and we're looking at 20 years minimum. But I'm curious about something else." She opened another folder. "Your wife's affair with Asher Trevon, the corporate sabotage of your business, the judicial corruption. You've documented crimes that go far beyond your father-in-law's Pentagon contracts. Crime is crime. True, but this feels personal." I thought about the wine dripping down my face, about Calla's laughter, about Ember's silence while her family humiliated me. "It is personal." Hartline nodded. "Good. Personal motivation makes for thorough investigation. It also makes for reliable witnesses." She closed the folder. "Are you prepared to testify against your wife?" "If necessary." "It will be necessary. The corporate espionage case requires your testimony about how she accessed your files. The conspiracy charges require you to establish the connections between all the players." "What about my son?" "That's a family court matter. But I can tell you that Judge Trasker won't be hearing your case. He'll be too busy with his own legal problems." 2 days later, I was having lunch at Murphy's bar when Asher Trevin walked in. He didn't see me at first. I was sitting in a corner booth, reading a newspaper and eating a sandwich. But when he approached the bar, I folded my paper and walked over. "Asher," I said, sliding onto the stool next to him. "Fancy meeting you here." He turned, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "Holden, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I bet." I signaled the bartender. "Whiskey, neat, make it a double." Asher shifted uncomfortably. He was a big man, used to intimidating people through size and wealth, but sitting next to me he seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "How's business?" I asked conversationally. "Fine, good. You know how it is." "Actually, I don't. My business has been struggling lately, losing clients, canceled contracts. It's been puzzling." The bartender brought my whiskey. I took a sip and watched Asher in the mirror behind the bar. "Maybe you could give me some advice," I continued. "You seem to know a lot about the cybersecurity market, about my clients, about my proposals." Asher's hand tightened around his beer bottle. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. You and Zane Marinor have been very thorough, very professional. I have to admire the coordination involved. Holden, I think you've got the wrong idea about—" I turned to face him directly. "How's Ember?" The question hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for a moment I thought he might fall off his stool. "What?" "My wife. Ember. You remember her, right? Tall, blonde, married to me. You've been spending a lot of time with her lately." Asher set down his beer and started to stand. "I think I should go." I grabbed his wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to keep him in place. "Sit down, Asher. We're having a conversation." He looked around the bar, probably hoping for support. But Murphy's was a working-class place, full of construction workers and truck drivers who had no sympathy for wealthy contractors in expensive suits. "I know about the affair," I said quietly. "I know about the corporate sabotage. I know about the weapons shipments. I know about Judge Trasker and the fixed custody cases. I know everything." Asher's breathing was shallow now, panicked. "You can't prove anything." I smiled. "Actually, I can. GPS tracking, financial records, email metadata, shipping manifests, bank transfers. I've been very thorough." "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something. You thought you were playing games with a nobody, a failed businessman who couldn't fight back. You thought wrong." I finished my whiskey and stood up. "The FBI will be contacting you soon. I'd recommend getting a very good lawyer." I left him sitting at the bar, staring into his beer like it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Outside in the parking lot, I found his Mercedes and used my keys to carve a simple message into the driver's side door. "Home wrecker." Then I slashed his tires. It was petty, but sometimes petty feels good. That evening, Ember came home earlier than usual. She found me in the kitchen, making dinner for myself and our son Nate, who was playing with toy trucks at the kitchen table. "You're home early," I observed. "Asher called. He said you approached him at some bar. He said you threatened him." I looked up from the stove. "Did he mention why I might have done that?" Ember glanced at Nate, who was absorbed in his toys. "We need to talk, privately." I followed her into the living room where she turned to face me with the expression of a woman who'd been caught but wasn't ready to admit it. "I don't know what you think you know," she began. "I know you've been sleeping with Asher Trevin for 8 months. I know you've been passing my business information to your father, who's been sharing it with competitors. I know about the weapons smuggling and the judicial corruption and the Pentagon fraud." Each revelation hit her like a separate blow. By the time I finished, she was sitting on the sofa, staring at me with something approaching shock. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to document everything. Long enough to build a federal case. Long enough to make sure that when this family falls, it falls hard." "What about Nate?" I looked toward the kitchen, where our 7-year-old son was making engine noises with his trucks. "What about him?" He's your son. Is he? The question hung in the air between us like a blade. Ember's face went white. Of course he is. How can you even ask that? 7 months, Ember. From your Denver trip to his birth. Either he was premature, or you've been lying about more than just business trips. He was premature, you know that. 8 pounds, 2 ounces is premature? She stood up abruptly. I'm not having this conversation. You're being paranoid and cruel and… I'm being realistic about our marriage, about your family, about what's going to happen when the FBI finishes their investigation. What investigation? I smiled. The one that starts with raids on your father's construction sites. The one that ends with federal prison sentences for everyone involved in his criminal enterprise. You're bluffing. Am I? She studied my face, looking for tells, for signs that I was lying or exaggerating. She didn't find any. Why are you doing this? I thought about the wine in my face, about years of humiliation and disrespect, about discovering that my wife was cheating, my business was being sabotaged, and my entire life was built on lies. Because I can, I said. The next morning, I woke up to find Ember's side of the bed empty. Her car was gone from the driveway, and a note on the kitchen counter said she'd taken Nate to her sister's house. I wasn't surprised. Cornered animals always run to their pack. What surprised me was how little I cared. I made coffee and sat in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard where Nate played every summer, where we'd hosted barbecues and birthday parties and all the rituals of suburban family life. It had been a good life in many ways, but it had been built on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation was cracking. My phone rang. Colonel. FBI raids start tomorrow, he said. 3 construction sites, 2 warehouses, and Drake's main office. Heartline wants you there as a consultant. What about the family? Ember and the boy are at Calla's house. Drake's been making calls all morning, probably trying to move assets offshore. Too late for that, but he doesn't know it yet. And Asher? Lawyered up. But his lawyer can't help him with the weapons charges. Federal mandatory minimums don't negotiate. I hung up and finished my coffee, thinking about tomorrow. About watching federal agents tear apart Drake's empire while he stood helpless to stop them. About the look on his face when he realized that the man he'd humiliated with wine was the same man who'd destroyed everything he'd built. It was going to be a very good day. I was standing in Agent Heartline's surveillance van at 5:47 a.m. when the first FBI team breached Drake's main warehouse. Through the radio chatter and video feeds, I watched federal agents swarm through the building like ants, documenting everything, photographing everything, seizing everything. Container 7, came a voice over the radio. We've got the Croatian shipment. Weapons are exactly where the GPS indicated. Heartline looked at me with something approaching admiration. Your tracking devices were remarkably accurate. I had good motivation to be thorough. On the monitor, I watched agents pry open wooden crates that were supposed to contain construction equipment. Instead, they found military-grade weapons that had been smuggled through 3 countries and 2 sets of customs inspections. Drake Torrin Construction had been importing enough firepower to outfit a small army. Team 3, report. Heartline spoke into her radio. Pentagon fraud documentation secured. We've got invoices, shipping manifests, and material certifications going back 6 years. Initial estimate is $47 million in fraudulent billing. Exactly what I'd calculated. It's satisfying when your work is validated by federal agents. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You've made a terrible mistake. This family will destroy you. I showed the message to Heartline. Calla Torrin, I said. Ember's sister. Threatening a federal witness is a felony, Heartline observed. Should I have someone pick her up? Not yet. Let her make more mistakes first. At 6:15 a.m., Drake Torrin arrived at his warehouse to find it surrounded by federal vehicles. I watched through binoculars as he climbed out of his truck, surveyed the scene, and began shouting at the agents who approached him. Even from a distance, I could see the moment when he realized this wasn't a routine inspection or a bureaucratic misunderstanding. This was the end of everything he'd built. "Sir, you need to step back," an agent was telling him. "This is my property. You can't just—" "We have federal warrants, Mr. Torrin. Please move away from the building." Drake's face was red with rage and confusion. He pulled out his phone, probably calling his lawyer, probably calling Judge Trasker, probably calling anyone who might help him understand what was happening. None of them could help him now. "Team 2, status report," Heartline requested. "Judge Trasker's residence secured. Subject is in custody. Bank records and financial documents seized." I felt a deep satisfaction hearing those words. Judge Trasker had spent 15 years corrupting the family court system, destroying lives and families for money. Now he would discover what justice looked like when it couldn't be purchased. At 7:30 a.m., Asher Trevin was arrested at his office. I wasn't there to see it, but Colonel called with details. "Went quietly," he reported. His lawyer was already there, which suggests he knew this was coming. Probably got a heads up from someone in Drake's organization. "What about the weapons charges?" "Federal prosecutor is recommending 20 years. Asher's lawyer wants to negotiate, but there's not much to negotiate with. Mandatory minimums are mandatory." By noon, the raids were complete. Drake Torrin construction was officially under federal investigation. Drake himself was in custody, charged with weapons smuggling, procurement fraud, and conspiracy. Judge Trasker was facing corruption charges that would end his career and probably his freedom. Asher Trevin was looking at 2 decades in federal prison, and Ember was about to discover that her affair had been with a man who was now a convicted felon. I drove home to an empty house and found 3 messages on my answering machine. The first was from Ember. "Holden, we need to talk. This has gone too far." The second was from Calla. "You think you're clever, but you have no idea what you've started. This family has resources you can't imagine." The third was from Drake's lawyer. "Mr. Ravel, my client would like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Please call at your earliest convenience." I deleted all 3 messages without returning the calls. That evening, Ember came home. She looked exhausted, defeated, like a woman who'd spent the day watching her world collapse. "Where's Nate?" I asked. "With my mother. I thought we should talk without him here." She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together for 8 years, where we'd helped Nate with homework, where we'd planned vacations and discussed our future. "The FBI came to Calla's house," she said. "They asked questions about you, about what you might know, about how long you'd been planning this." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I had no idea you were capable of something like this." "Something like what? Exposing criminals? Providing evidence of federal crimes? Helping law enforcement do their job? Something like destroying an entire family." I leaned back in my chair. "I didn't destroy your family, Ember. Your family destroyed itself. I just documented the process. My father is 70 years old. He has cancer. This stress could finish him. Your father is a criminal who's been stealing from the Pentagon for 6 years. He smuggled weapons. He corrupted judges. He's lucky the stress is his biggest problem. What about Nate? What about him? He's going to grow up knowing his grandfather is in prison, knowing his family name is associated with scandal and crime. He's also going to grow up knowing that crime has consequences. That might be the most valuable lesson he ever learns." Ember stared at me across the table. "I don't know who you are anymore. I'm the same person I've always been. You just never bothered to pay attention. The affair was a symptom, not the cause. You stopped loving me years ago, Ember. You just didn't have the courage to admit it. So you decided to destroy everything instead of just asking for a divorce?" I thought about that question. It was fair, in a way. I could have simply left, filed for divorce, fought for custody, moved on with my life. But that wouldn't have addressed the larger problem. Drake's crimes would have continued. Judge Trasker would have kept corrupting the court system. Asher would have kept sabotaging my business and sleeping with other men's wives. Some problems require more than just walking away, I said. What happens now? Now you decide what kind of person you want to be. Your father and your lover are going to prison. Your sister is probably going to be charged as an accessory. You can go down with them, or you can cooperate with the federal investigation and try to salvage something from this mess. What about us? There is no us. There hasn't been for a long time. She started crying then, quiet tears that might have been for our marriage or her family or the life she'd thought she was going to have. I felt sorry for her, in a distant way, but I didn't feel guilty. You reap what you sow. The Torrin family had been sowing corruption and betrayal for years. Now it was harvest time. I'll need to know about Nate's paternity, I said. DNA test. If he's my son, I want full custody. If he's not, I want that documented for the divorce proceedings. He's your son. Then you won't mind the test. She wiped her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been hatred. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've tried to be thorough. What if I fight you? What if I hire lawyers and drag this out for years? With what money? Your father's assets are frozen. Asher's accounts are seized. Judge Trasker can't help you anymore. And any lawyer you hire will have to deal with the fact that you're married to the federal government's star witness. You bastard. Maybe, but I'm a bastard who's going to win. She left that night and didn't come back. 3 days later, her lawyer called to discuss divorce terms. A week after that, DNA results confirmed that Nate was my biological son. 2 weeks after the raids, Drake Torrin was found unresponsive in his jail cell. Not from violence or suicide, but from the cancer that had been consuming him for months. The stress of his arrest had accelerated the disease, and his body had simply given up. He passed away without ever standing trial, without ever facing a jury, without ever being held accountable for the crimes he'd committed. But his empire was still destroyed. His family was still ruined. And I was still standing when the smoke cleared. Sometimes that has to be enough. 3 months after Drake's passing, I was sitting in my lawyer's office signing the final divorce papers. Ember sat across from me, flanked by her attorney, looking like a woman who'd aged 10 years in 3 months. The settlement was straightforward. I kept the house, which was legally mine anyway, since Drake's fraudulent property transfers had been voided by the federal court. I got full custody of Nate, with Ember receiving supervised visitation every other weekend. She got her car, her personal belongings, and enough money to start over somewhere far from the wreckage of her family's reputation. The non-disclosure agreement, her lawyer said, sliding a document across the table. My client agrees not to discuss the federal investigation or her family's legal troubles with media outlets. I reviewed the document. It was standard language, designed to prevent Ember from selling her story to tabloids or writing a tell-all book about life with the Torrins. What about social media, I asked, covered under the general prohibition against public statements? I signed the agreement. Ember's silence was worth the minor financial concessions I'd made in the settlement. One more thing, I said as we prepared to leave. Calla's been posting on social media about the case, suggesting that I fabricated evidence, claiming that her father was innocent. Ember's lawyer looked uncomfortable. My client can't control her sister's behavior. No, but she can warn her that defaming a federal witness carries serious legal consequences. I'll pass along your concerns. After the lawyers left, Ember and I sat alone in the conference room for a moment. She looked tired, defeated, like a woman who'd lost everything that mattered to her. Are you satisfied? She asked. I'm resolved. My father is gone. Asher is in prison. My family's business is destroyed. Our marriage is over. What more do you want? I thought about that question. What did I want? I wanted Nate to grow up understanding that actions have consequences. I wanted him to know that crime doesn't pay, that corruption eventually collapses, that justice sometimes requires patience, but always arrives eventually. I wanted him to be proud of his father. I want you to be a good mother, I said. I want you to learn from this experience. I want you to build a life that doesn't depend on other people's crimes. That's very generous of you. It's practical. Nate needs his mother, even if I don't need my wife. She gathered her purse and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. Do you ever regret it? Destroying everything instead of just walking away? I considered the question seriously. Did I regret exposing Drake's crimes? Did I regret bringing down a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years? Did I regret ensuring that corrupt judges and weapons smugglers faced justice? No, I said. I don't regret it. Even knowing what it cost us? Especially knowing what it cost us. She left without another word. That evening, I picked up Nate from Ember's mother's house. He was quiet during the drive home, processing the changes in his life with the resilience that children somehow manage. Dad, he said as we pulled into our driveway, why did Grandpa Drake go to jail? I'd been dreading this question, but also preparing for it. He broke some important rules, I said. Rules that are designed to keep people safe. What kind of rules? Rules about being honest. Rules about not taking things that don't belong to you. Rules about treating people fairly. Is that why Mom doesn't live with us anymore? Your mom and I decided we'd be happier living in different houses, but we both love you very much, and that will never change. He seemed to accept this explanation, at least for now. There would be more questions as he got older, more complex discussions about family and justice, and the choices people make. But for now, it was enough. 6 months later, I was reading the newspaper over breakfast when I came across a small item buried in the business section. Trevon Defense Contractors declares bankruptcy. Asher's company had collapsed without him. Government contracts canceled. Commercial clients fled. Employees laid off. The business he'd spent 20 years building was liquidated to pay legal fees and federal fines. I felt a moment of satisfaction reading about his company's demise. Then I turned the page and forgot about it. Revenge is like a fever. It burns hot while you need it, then breaks and leaves you feeling normal again. I'd needed that fever to sustain me through months of investigation and documentation and federal cooperation. Now I needed something else. A future. I was considering my options when Colonel called with an interesting proposition. FBI wants to offer you a permanent consulting position, he said. Financial Crimes Division. You'd be investigating procurement fraud, corporate corruption, the kind of cases where your background would be valuable. Based in Houston? Based wherever the cases take you, but Houston would be home base, so Nate wouldn't have to change schools. It was tempting. I'd enjoyed working with Agent Hartline and her team. I'd found satisfaction in using my skills to expose criminals and build cases that would hold up in federal court. I'd also discovered that I was very good at it. What's the pay? Enough to rebuild your cybersecurity business if you want, or enough to start something new. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. Hartline wants an answer by the end of the month. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, looking out at the backyard where Nate was playing with his trucks. He was building roads in the sandbox, creating elaborate construction projects with the focused intensity that reminded me of myself at his age. He was a good kid, smart, curious, resilient. He deserved a father who was building something positive instead of tearing down something negative. Maybe it was time to stop looking backward and start looking forward. I called Colonel back and accepted the FBI position. 2 weeks later, I was cleaning out my home office when I found a box of photographs from happier times. Pictures of Ember and me on our honeymoon, family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. For a moment, I felt a pang of loss for the life we'd had before everything went wrong, before the affairs and the lies and the crimes that had poisoned everything we'd built together. Then I remembered the wine dripping down my face, the laughter, the years of disrespect and humiliation. I threw the photographs away. That evening, Nate and I grilled hamburgers in the backyard and talked about his upcoming school year. He was excited about third grade, about his new teacher, about the science fair project he was already planning. "Dad," he said as we were cleaning up, "are you happy?" It was a surprisingly complex question from an 8-year-old. "Yes," I said, and realized I meant it. "I'm happy." "Good. I want you to be happy. I want you to be happy too, buddy." "I am happy. I like living here with you." We finished cleaning up and went inside to watch a movie. Something with superheroes and explosions and clear distinctions between good and evil. The kind of story where justice always wins and the bad guys always lose. The kind of story I'd been living for the past year. As the credits rolled, I thought about the future, about the FBI cases I'd be working on, about the criminals I'd help expose, about the life I'd build with my son. It was going to be a good life, different from what I'd planned, but better than what I'd had. And if the Torrin family had taught me anything, it was that sometimes you have to tear down the old foundation before you can build something new. Sometimes you have to break a few chairs before you can sit comfortably again. Outside, a January wind was blowing through the trees, carrying away the last leaves of the old year and making room for whatever was coming next. I was ready for it. All of it. The chair had broken first, but I was still standing, and that was enough.